She's dead weight. The chemo slowed her down. I give it a month before she's out. Watch me. I recognized the voice immediately, even with the background noise of clinking glasses and a live jazz band muddling the audio. It was unmistakably Greg Fulton, Executive Vice President at Whitmore, Langley standing tall in the middle of a group of my colleagues, holding a scotch in one hand and smirking like a man who thought he was in complete control. The problem? The dead weight he was mocking was me. The video was short, barely a minute long, but every second of it carved itself into my memory. It had been recorded at the company's annual gala, an event I had missed because I had just completed my third round of chemotherapy. It landed in my inbox Sunday night, sent from Ethan, a junior analyst I had mentored from day one, the same young man who once asked me which folder a proposal belonged in. The email had no subject, just one line. You should see this before Monday. I must have watched it a dozen times. My fingers grew numb, not from fear, but from something colder clarity. Greg, half laughing, leaned toward the group and said, "She thinks she's irreplaceable, but give it a month. Margaret Dawson will just be a memory." There was laughter, applause even, a few uneasy glances, but not one person stood up or walked away. I sat alone in my living room, the glow of my phone screen reflecting on my pale face in the dark, and something inside me fractured. For over 2 decades, I had poured myself into Whitmore, Langley skipping birthdays, missing my nephew's wedding, even spending nights beside spreadsheets instead of beside my husband when he was in the ICU. I thought loyalty was a form of currency, something that would protect me when age, illness, and exhaustion began to catch up. But that video was a reality check. I wasn't legacy. I was liability. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, feeling my pulse slow with a calm that surprised even me. Because in that moment, I knew something Greg didn't. If they thought I would walk away quietly, if they believed cancer had dulled my instincts or stolen my dignity, they were about to learn a hard lesson. And I was going to be the one to teach it. Loyalty is a word people throw around easily in boardrooms and business emails. Thanks for your loyalty, they say when you hit your 10-year mark. Or, we value loyalty, right before they ask you to sacrifice another weekend for a last-minute project. But to me, it was never a corporate buzzword. It was something sacred. I believed in showing up, even when it was hard, even when no one noticed. And for over 2 decades, I showed up for Whitmore Langley, like it was my own name on the building's front door. I was there when the firm nearly collapsed during the recession in '08, pulling double shifts to secure client renewals while the partners were too paralyzed by fear to even call their accounts. I picked up the pieces when a senior manager was caught falsifying reports. I was the one who soothed the clients, revised the numbers, and testified before the board without letting a single drop of scandal reach the press. I stayed quiet when bonuses were slashed, but executive travel remained untouched. I covered for Greg's missed deadlines, talked him through his investor calls, and even rewrote half his keynote the night before a major industry summit while he drank bourbon at the hotel bar downstairs. That was just who I was. A fixer, a shield, a constant. And perhaps that was my greatest mistake. Because while I was burning myself out in the name of teamwork and integrity, what I didn't realize was that I had slowly become invisible, taken for granted by the very people who once relied on me to keep the walls from crumbling. When I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer last spring, I told myself not to panic. I was scared, of course I was. But I also knew my value. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that after everything I had given, someone would stand up and say, "Take the time you need, we'll cover you." Or at the very least, "We've got your back." But no one did. There were polite nods, half-hearted smiles, and HR scripted, "You're entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid leave if you need it," as if illness were a luxury I had asked for. Still, I kept showing up. I worked through treatment as best I could, my hair thinning under the sterile office lights, my energy faltering mid-afternoon, and my breath shortened by medication that made me feel older than my 59 years. I didn't ask for sympathy, only space. I brought a blanket to work when the chills started hitting mid-morning and kept a bottle of ginger tea in my drawer to fight the nausea. But I never complained. I never missed a deadline. I was slower, yes, but I was still steady, still loyal. Looking back, I think that's what hurts the most. That even in my most vulnerable state, I still wanted to believe I mattered. that all those years would count for something when the ledger came due. That the people I protected, especially Greg, would remember who held the firm together while they were too busy posturing for power. But the moment that video landed in my hands, I saw the truth, clear as the cancer in my scans. I had become disposable. And yet, even as that realization settled in my bones like the cold of an Ohio winter, I felt something shift, not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but a deeper, colder resolve. Because I hadn't lost everything, not yet. I still had my name, my knowledge, my connections. I knew where the pressure points were. I knew which clients Greg had taken for granted and which contracts were hanging by threads I once held tight. I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. But what they didn't know, what Greg in particular would soon come to regret, is that behind every quiet woman they tried to erase is a storm that's been waiting patiently to rewrite the ending. The first time I felt the lump, I told myself it was nothing, just the kind of harmless, fibrous knot women my age often find and forget. But deep down, there was a part of me that knew something wasn't right. I waited 3 weeks before I saw my doctor. Not because I was too busy, but because I was afraid of what it might mean. Not just for my health, but for my place in a company that already viewed me as part of the old guard, a fixture rather than a future. When the biopsy came back, it didn't come with drama or tears. My doctor delivered the news in a measured tone: stage 2 invasive ductal carcinoma, treatable but aggressive. And just like that, the ground beneath me shifted. I didn't cry. I sat still, nodding quietly, as if I were being given the results of a quarterly report. Years of corporate conditioning had trained me to suppress emotion and focus on solutions. So I asked for the treatment plan, the timeline, the odds. I asked how long I could delay surgery and how functional I would be during chemo. I didn't ask if I'd survive. I already knew I would. What I didn't know was whether the world I returned to would still have space for me in it. Telling HR was like handing them a loaded gun and asking them to hold it steady. They smiled too wide, thanked me for being transparent, and assured me that the firm stands by its people. But I saw the subtle shift in their eyes, the way they glanced down at their screens before saying, "Of course, take whatever time you need, within policy." It was the same line they gave interns who broke an ankle skiing, not senior partners who'd helped carry the firm through 3 leadership changes and 2 recessions. Greg, of course, played the concerned colleague. He sent a bouquet of flowers that wilted before the end of the week and told me to focus on healing while quietly reallocating my clients temporarily to his inner circle. My name began to disappear from project memos. Meetings were rescheduled without copying me in. I was still logging on, still dragging my aching body through reports and deliverables, while managing side effects that felt like a war inside my bloodstream, but it was clear the decision had already been made, just not yet spoken aloud. I had become, in every practical sense, expendable. The chemo sessions were a strange kind of silence. Hours spent under sterile lights, surrounded by others whose lives had been similarly disrupted, whose hair thinned just as mine did, whose eyes carried the weight of knowing their worth was being recalculated by systems that measured productivity above humanity. I would often bring my laptop, answering emails with trembling fingers, refusing to fall behind, as if staying connected would somehow tether me to the world I feared I was being slowly pushed out of. But there was a moment somewhere between the second and third cycle when I looked at my reflection in the clinic window and hardly recognized the woman I saw. Her skin was sallow, her cheekbones sharper, her hair tucked beneath a scarf meant more for warmth than modesty. Yet behind her tired eyes, there was something defiant. A flicker, a fire that hadn't gone out, just dimmed, and in that moment, I realized I had a choice. I could fade, like they were expecting. I could bow out gracefully, grateful for severance and sympathy, taking my story quietly to the shadows. Or I could watch, I could wait, and when the time was right, I could act. Because beneath the fatigue, beneath the hospital gowns and the painkillers and the polite pity, I still remembered who I was. I was the woman who once rebuilt a client portfolio from scratch after an acquisition gutted our resources. I was the woman who stayed late when others ducked out early, who read contracts like novels and found errors no one else even knew to look for. Cancer hadn't erased that. Age hadn't dulled that. And no whisper behind my back, not even Greg's, was going to define my ending. They had mistaken illness for weakness. But what they didn't understand is that nothing sharpens resolve quite like facing your own mortality and surviving it. By the time I received the calendar invite, I already knew what was coming. It arrived early Sunday morning, tucked between grocery store coupons and a reminder from my pharmacy to refill my anti-nausea meds. The subject line read, Staffing Review, Monday 9:00 a.m., Conference Room B. There was no message body, no preamble, just my name and the name of Denise Cartwright from HR. And though they didn't say it, I knew you always know when the walls start closing in. Still, I showed up that Monday as if it were any other workday, arriving 15 minutes early in a pressed navy blazer that no longer fit quite right around the shoulders. I walked through the lobby with my head held high, past interns who barely looked up from their screens and associates who used to greet me with respect, but now offered only awkward glances and tightened nods. I could feel it in the air, the shift in energy that precedes a quiet execution. They all knew, or at least suspected, and yet no one said a word. Greg's office door was ajar, as usual, and through it I saw him laughing with someone from finance. His body relaxed, his smile wide, as though this were just another Monday. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. He didn't flinch, he didn't blink. He simply nodded, as if we were still colleagues, as if he hadn't, just days earlier, stood in a room full of people and declared my time at this company expired. I returned the nod, polite and unreadable, then turned toward the conference room where the real performance would begin. Denise was already seated when I walked in, her posture straight, but her eyes avoiding mine. The kind of avoidance that only comes when someone's been tasked with delivering a verdict they didn't write. Greg arrived moments later, flipping through a manila folder with unnecessary precision, buying time he didn't need. He opened with pleasantry show grateful the company was for my years of dedication, how difficult restructuring had been for leadership, how the industry's changing landscape had made certain decisions unavoidable. I let him speak. I let him lay out his carefully rehearsed script, one that had clearly been drafted to minimize liability, not emotion. Words like transition, realignment, and workforce optimization floated around the room like perfumed poison, designed to sound clinical, not cruel. Denise slid a packet across the table, neatly labeled severance agreement, while Greg offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and said, "We hope this can be a graceful next chapter for you, Margaret." I didn't touch the folder. I didn't ask questions. I didn't cry. Instead, I looked Greg directly in the eye and, in a voice as calm and steady as if we were discussing printer settings, I asked, "So this is final then?" There was a flicker so brief, I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching closely, a glimmer of hesitation, perhaps even guilt, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same smug confidence that had always cloaked his incompetence. "Yes," he said. "This decision is final." Good, I thought. That's exactly what I needed to hear. I stood, smoothed the fabric of my blazer, and offered a small, composed smile loan I had perfected after decades of client management and executive appeasement. "Thank you both," I said softly, then reached for the severance packet, not because I intended to sign it, but because I wanted them to believe, even for a moment, that I had accepted this silently, that I was going to fade, politely and predictably, like they wanted me to. But as I walked out of that room and back through the open floor of the office, past the cubicles and whispers and half-hidden glances, something in me crystallized. They didn't just remove me, they erased me. A woman who had carried their weight for 23 years was now just a line item cleared from the budget. There would be no farewell party, no speech, no signed card with awkward jokes about retirement, just an empty desk and a name that would vanish from internal memos by end of week. But what Greg and the others hadn't accounted for, what they would never understand until it was far too late, was that I hadn't left empty-handed, because I still had access. I still had every client relationship I had built over 2 decades, every report I had crafted with my own hands, every email thread that proved exactly who had done the real work while others took the credit. And above all, I still had time. What they thought was the end was only the beginning. The next morning, I returned to the office just as I always had at 7:55 a.m. Sharp, cardigan, neatly buttoned, lips faintly colored, posture as calm as a chapel pew. If anyone noticed that my steps were quieter or my eyes steadier than usual, they didn't say so. The scent of burnt coffee lingered in the hallway, the dull clatter of keyboards filled the air, and phones rang with the same restless urgency they always had, as if the building itself hadn't just tried to erase me. That was the beauty of their arrogance. They believed in clean exits and silent endings. But I hadn't left yet. Not truly. Not until I decided it was time. Greg's door was open again, just like the day before. And this time, he stood in front of the window, sunlight bouncing off his cufflinks, speaking too loudly about quarterly projections, as if rehearsing a line for a play he didn't write. I paused briefly in the doorway, offered a polite "good morning," and waited just long enough for our eyes to meet. He answered with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, asking if I was feeling refreshed and ready to close out the month strong. I smiled, not too wide, and said, "More than you know." And so, the game began. For the next 4 weeks, I played the part they had cast me in, the reliable professional quietly wrapping up her work before drifting into obscurity. I attended meetings with impeccable punctuality, offered feedback that was measured but insightful, and completed tasks faster than expected. If someone looked closely, they might have seen it, the slight chill in my tone, the way I asked too many questions about account access or requested one final copy of a contract for clarity. But no one was paying attention. After all, I was no longer a threat. I was yesterday's news. What they didn't realize was that beneath the steady rhythm of routine, I was building something far more precise than anger. I was gathering facts, linking patterns, preparing leverage. Every email I archived, every outdated vendor list I examined, every client report I copied, each piece became part of a map I was quietly drawing, a blueprint of the company's soft underbelly that Greg had either ignored or failed to secure. And I knew exactly where to press. But it wasn't just about files and numbers. I also began reconnecting with clients, those who had remained loyal not to the brand, but to me. I reached out under the pretense of checking in before my transition, expressing subtle curiosity about how their needs might evolve in the coming quarter. Their responses weren't just warm, they were instant. There were questions, interest, hesitation about what would happen once I was gone. It didn't take much to sow the first seeds of doubt. At night, I documented everything: notes, timelines, email threads. My personal laptop, sitting quietly on the corner of my kitchen table, became the command center of my quiet war. I contacted a corporate attorney I trusted, a woman named Evelyn, herself once pushed out of a firm she built, who helped me understand what I could use, what I couldn't, and where the gray zones lived. She didn't ask for details. She just said, "Build it carefully, and don't let them see it coming." There was one more call I made, this time to a competitor. Sterling. Rowe had always been circling the edges of our market, sniffing around for opportunities to poach clients or scoop up floundering talent. I didn't approach them with desperation. I came with value, clear, tangible, strategic value that didn't beg for a seat at the table, but rather offered them a path to the head of it. We didn't talk in hypotheticals. We spoke in numbers, forecasts, contracts up for renewal, and names, very specific names. The truth is, I hadn't fully understood how deeply I had rooted myself in the company until I began pulling my knowledge apart piece by piece. For years, I had been the quiet constant behind the curtain, negotiating calmly, smoothing tensions, anticipating disasters before they even made it to Greg's desk. I had held things together, not out of ambition, but out of pride. And now that pride had shifted direction, I was no longer trying to prove I belonged. I was proving what would happen without me. Each day I arrived early. Each evening I stayed late. But the files I touched weren't just for handover, they were strategic extractions, each one a thread pulled from the tapestry they thought would remain intact long after I was gone. Greg didn't notice. No one did. That was the advantage of being underestimated. They were so sure I had accepted their terms that it never occurred to them I was quietly rewriting the rules. I wasn't looking for revenge in fire or fury. I was building it in silence, with intention, with precision, and with a patience forged not in spite of my illness, but because of it. Because when you've stared down something as ruthless as cancer, you stop fearing slow destruction. You learn that the sharpest damage is the one they never feel until it's far too late. The morning of my final day arrived without ceremony. There were no farewells scheduled, no HR cake in the break room, No email from Greg thanking me for decades of contribution. Just a quiet Thursday with drizzle on the windows, the kind of gray sky that feels neither mourning nor celebration imply. Inevitable. I arrived early, as I always did, my heels echoing faintly down the marble hallway that had once felt like a second home. But this time, every step felt like it belonged to someone else, someone walking through the remnants of a place they had already begun to leave behind. Greg hadn't spoken to me since the meeting. He didn't need to. He thought the matter was settled, that I had taken my folder, my severance, and whatever pride I had left, and was preparing to walk away quietly. And in a way, I had, but not in the direction he imagined. By 10:30 a.m., I had completed the final tasks they expected from me, handing over open projects, forwarding critical access credentials, double-checking shared drives to make sure nothing had accidentally disappeared. To the casual observer, I was the image of grace, tidying loose ends with humility and professionalism. But beneath the surface, the gears had already shifted into place, the final pins aligned for the blow I had waited patiently to strike. At precisely 11:42 a.m., I opened my personal email, clicked compose, and addressed a message to Richard Lanethi, CEO of Halberg Industries, Whitmore, Langley's largest client, and a man I had worked with personally for nearly 16 years. My message was brief, measured, and free of sentiment. I told him I was moving on from the firm and would soon be available for private consultation. I expressed appreciation for our collaboration, acknowledged the critical work we had done together, and extended an open offer to reconnect. No pressure, no urgency, just the seed of a future that didn't include Greg Fulton or the firm he led. I reread it once, then twice, ensuring the tone was clean and professional. Then I hit send. I closed my laptop slowly, almost reverently, and leaned back in my chair. The room was quiet, but the silence felt different now, less like absence and more like anticipation. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, no grand confrontation or public shaming, but in that single, understated message, I had removed the keystone of Greg's carefully stacked illusion. Because what he never understood, what none of them did, was that I hadn't just managed relationships. I was the relationship. I spent the rest of the afternoon playing the part I knew by heart, saying goodbye with poise, exchanging empty smiles, shaking hands that had once held genuine warmth, but now offered nothing but relief. Relief that I was leaving. Relief that they wouldn't have to explain, or choose sides, or look too closely at the mirror I represented. That was fine. I didn't need their validation. I wasn't leaving for them. Just before 5:00 p.m., I performed one last act of closure. I archived my entire work, history emails, reports, contracts, presentations, everything I had created, managed, or influenced, neatly organized and stored. I wasn't stealing. I wasn't sabotaging. I was preserving evidence, history, ownership, quiet power. And then, with the clock ticking toward 5, I logged out for the final time and walked out of the building with my bag on my shoulder, my hair tucked beneath a scarf, and the strange, weightless freedom of someone who no longer owed anyone anything. That night, as rain tapped gently against the kitchen window, my phone buzzed. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. It was always the ones who had the most to lose who reached out first. I let it ring, then silenced it. 10 minutes later, another call came, and then another. No voicemail, no text, just silence between rings. Then, at 10:07 p.m., a name finally appeared: Ethan, the junior analyst I had mentored all those years ago. His message was short, frantic, and barely coherent. Margaret, Richard just pulled the contract. Greg's losing it. Whatever you did, it worked. I stared at the words on the screen, my pulse calm, steady, unshaken. I didn't reply. Not yet. Because this wasn't about celebration or gloating. It wasn't about watching Greg panic or watching the walls start to crack. It was about one simple truth finally catching up with him, that the person he dismissed as weak, sick, and replaceable had been the spine of the entire operation. And now that spine had chosen to walk away, taking everything that mattered with her. By the time I opened my eyes the next morning, my phone had already buzzed twice. The screen lit up with an unknown number, then went dark again. I ignored it. I brewed my tea slowly, letting the steam rise into the quiet morning like a kind of ceremony, and sat by the window as the first emails of the day trickled in. There were no headlines yet, no official announcements, but I knew the aftershocks had begun. At 10:04 a.m., I received a second text from Ethan, short and staccato. Lane pulled everything. 4 departments in panic mode. Greg's called 3 emergency meetings already. I didn't reply. Not yet. I imagined Greg pacing his office, voice growing sharp with each unanswered call, as he tried to piece together what had gone wrong. He had never planned for this, not because the company couldn't survive losing a contract, but because in his mind, I had never been important enough to matter. That was always his greatest miscalculation. He assumed the foundation would hold even if he stripped it of its structure. What he failed to understand was that I was the structure. By noon, it wasn't just internal chaos. Whispers were starting to move through clients and vendors' mails not returned, deliverables delayed, project teams splintering under stress they weren't trained to handle. I could feel it unraveling from the outside in, like fabric tugged at too many corners by hands that no longer remembered who stitched it together. Richard Lane's quiet exit had become a signal. If he was leaving, others would follow. Not out of loyalty to me, but because people with power don't wait around to see who gets blamed. They move first, protect their own, and leave the ones who fall behind to deal with the wreckage. At 2:36 p.m., I answered my phone. Greg's voice was tense, measured in a way that told me he had spent the last several hours pretending everything was under control while watching it slip between his fingers. He didn't open with anger. He opened with confusion. "Margaret, I just spoke with Lane. He said you'd reached out?" "I did," I answered simply, holding back nothing, but offering no elaboration. He hesitated. "Look, I think there's been some sort of misunderstanding. He seems to think you're consulting now, possibly with a competitor. I'm trying to reassure him, but..." His voice trailed off, grasping for a tone that had always come easy but now sounded hollow. I didn't let the silence linger too long. "There's no misunderstanding, Greg," I said, my voice low and even. I told him I'd be available. That's all. The pause on the other end felt longer than it was. Then came the shift, the moment where confusion bled into defensiveness, and behind that, fear. "Margaret, this isn't a smart move. You know how small this industry is. People talk. You don't want to start burning bridges now." And there it was, the threat, dressed up as advice. It would have rattled me once, maybe even 6 months ago. But now it only confirmed what I already knew. He was losing grip. "You're right," I said calmly. "People do talk, which is why you should be very careful about what you say next." He didn't respond to that, not directly. I could hear him breathing, could almost picture him clenching his jaw behind his desk, already planning how to spin this into something survivable. But what he hadn't yet grasped was that survival wasn't guaranteed anymore, not when you've lost the trust of your largest client, not when your senior staff are panicking, and certainly not when the person you dismissed as irrelevant was the only one holding it all together. By late afternoon, my inbox was filled with messages from former clients, curious partners, and even 2 employees still at Whitmore, Langley, asking if I had landed somewhere yet. The tremors were spreading fast, not because I was gloating or loud, but because silence, when paired with certainty, speaks louder than any declaration. At 5:13 p.m., a final text from Ethan arrived. "They just pulled the Monday pitch. Legal's involved. CFO's hold up. Greg looks like he hasn't slept. This is wild." I smiled, not out of joy, but with a deep, quiet sense of justice. For the first time in years, I felt what it meant to be seen, not as an employee, not as someone to rely on when things got hard, and certainly not as a burden, but as a force. As someone who had always mattered more than they realized. What was happening at Whitmore? Langley wasn't just fallout. It was consequence built not from spite, but from years of thankless loyalty and a final strategic refusal to accept erasure. And the collapse had only just begun. By Monday morning, Whitmore, Langley was no longer whispering behind glass walls, was unraveling in plain view. Emails that used to arrive like clockwork were suddenly delayed or unanswered. Clients who once signed renewals with nothing more than a phone call were now requesting meetings, renegotiations, and, in some cases, complete withdrawal. The air inside their offices, as Ethan later described it, had shifted from nervous to electric with fear, not anticipation. At 8:13 a.m., my phone buzzed with another message from him. Emergency board meeting. CFO's locked in his office with 2 attorneys. Greg's about to combust. Everyone's blaming everyone. I imagine the scene vividly, Greg pacing behind his desk, sleeves rolled, hair unkempt, voice cracking with that manufactured calm he used when trying to seem in control. He had likely spent the weekend making desperate calls, trying to assure clients that everything was fine, that my departure was routine, the Halberg Industries exit had nothing to do with performance. But lies, especially desperate ones, don't survive under scrutiny. And this time, there was nowhere to hide. I hadn't set out to destroy him. Not really. I just wanted him to feel at the sharp edge of being dismissed after decades of loyalty, the sting of watching something you built fall apart in someone else's careless hands, and the hollow ache of realizing too late that you let go of the wrong person. I didn't want chaos. I wanted clarity. And now, as the firm scrambled to plug holes in a ship they never thought would sink, that clarity was finally arriving. At 1:03 p.m., the board gathered in the executive conference room for an unscheduled vote. By then, the firm had already lost 3 major accounts, some of them worth more than a quarter of annual revenue. Investors were panicking, analysts were speculating, and internal leadership could no longer pretend this was a coincidence. It was a reckoning, and Greg Fulton was at the center of it. He tried, of course, to present his plan a rambling collection of jargon and inflated optimism laced with the same overconfidence that had led him to call me dead weight behind a glass of bourbon. But this time, no one was laughing. The board had reviewed the numbers. They had heard from clients. And they had finally, reluctantly, acknowledged the quiet truth they had ignored for years, that Greg had never built this house. He had simply lived in it while someone else kept the foundation strong. That someone was me. When the board vote concluded at 1:38 p.m., an internal email went out to all staff, crisp and unceremonious. Effective immediately, Gregory Fulton has stepped down from his role as Executive Vice President of Whitmore, Langley Consulting. Interim leadership will be announced in the coming days. I read the email twice, not out of disbelief, but to let it settle. It was quiet justice, the kind that doesn't need celebration to feel complete. Greg hadn't just been fired, he had been exposed. Not by slander or rumor, but by consequence. And that to me meant more than any confrontation ever could. At 5:47 p.m., I received an email from Greg himself. The subject line was, "Vague let's talk end." The body of the message was a mess of half apologies and veiled appeals. He spoke of history, of mutual respect, of misunderstandings that got out of hand. He wanted to meet, to clear the air, to salvage whatever reputation he had left. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Justice, I've learned, rarely arrives when you want it to. It doesn't come with applause or recognition, and it doesn't ask for permission. It moves slowly, like a tide unseen for a time, then all at once. When it finally comes, it doesn't shout. It removes, it clears space. It returns dignity not with force, but with quiet certainty. Greg had once laughed in a room full of people, confident I would never see the end coming. And now here I was, standing in that end, not as a victim, but as the one who wrote the final chapter. The days that followed Greg's fall passed not with celebration, but with the kind of stillness that often arrives after a long storm when the debris has settled, but the damage remains visible to anyone who dares to look. I didn't gloat. I didn't seek out headlines or whisper in boardrooms. I moved forward, step by step, through the unfamiliar rhythm of a life no longer tied to the walls I had once helped build. Sterling Rowe welcomed me not with fanfare, but with a quiet kind of respect that said more than any plaque ever could. My new office overlooked the Cleveland skyline. A city that had once felt like the backdrop to someone else's story now framed the beginning of my own. I spent my mornings meeting with clients, many of whom had followed me without hesitation, and my evenings watching the light change across the windows, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I should have expected that Greg wouldn't disappear quietly. Men like him rarely do. It was a Thursday afternoon, a little after 2, when my assistant knocked on the door with a hesitant expression that said more than her words. "Margaret," she said softly, There's someone asking to see you. Gregory Fulton. For a moment, I said nothing. I didn't need to. The name alone carried its own gravity. I nodded once. Send him in. When Greg walked through the door, it was like watching a shadow of a man I used to know. Same frame, same voice, but stripped of the polished arrogance he once wore like armor. His suit no longer hung with pride. It sagged at the shoulders. The smirk he'd once used to disarm a room had vanished, replaced by a forced neutrality that cracked around the edges. He didn't sit. He didn't speak right away. He looked around the office, the windows, the clean desk. The quiet confidence of a space that wasn't Heisen let out a breath he probably hadn't meant for me to hear. You really did it, he said, not accusingly, but with a kind of disbelief that didn't need a response. I tilted my head slightly, watching him the way you watch something delicate, not because you care if it breaks, but because you want to know if it was ever real to begin with. Did what? I asked, though we both knew the answer. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking away for just a second before returning. You destroyed me. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. Instead, I let the silence hang between us until the truth filled it on its own. He rubbed the back of his neck, the way he used to when things didn't go according to script, and then, finally, sat. Look, I know I made mistakes, he began, the words tumbling out without elegance or conviction. I was under pressure. The board, the investors, they expected results, and I handled things wrong, especially with you. His voice cracked slightly at the edges, and for a moment he almost sounded human. I should have valued what you brought. I should have protected you when you got sick, not tried to replace you. He looked up then, truly looked at me. I'm sorry. There it was an apology years too late, shaped not by guilt but by consequence. And yet, it carried a weight I hadn't expected. Not because I needed it, but because hearing it confirmed something I'd always known. He had known my worth. He had just chosen convenience over character. I stood slowly, walking over to where he sat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture. I simply said, You didn't destroy me, Greg. You just made the mistake of thinking you could. His eyes dropped, and the air in the room shifted again. Heavier now, less tense, but more final. I need a job, he said after a pause, almost as an afterthought, and I felt the irony settle between us like a closing curtain. I should have laughed. I should have reveled in the reversal. But I didn't, because the truth was, I didn't need revenge anymore. I had already won. So I looked at him, clear-eyed and calm, and said, You don't need a job, Greg. You need to learn something you should have learned a long time ago, how to respect the people who keep the lights on. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply nodded, stood, and walked out of my office with the slow, uneven steps of a man finally beginning to understand the cost of his decisions. And when the door closed behind him, I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. That evening, after Greg left my office for the last time, I stood by the window with a glass of red wine in hand and watched the city breathe below me. Cleveland had always been a city of quiet resilience, one that didn't scream its victories but carried them like scars stitched beneath the surface. And somehow, in the glow of that dusky skyline, I realized I had become a part of it, not as someone who simply survived, but as someone who reclaimed what she was told she had lost forever. In the weeks that followed, the story of Whitmore Langley's implosion made its rounds. Not in scandal sheets or flashy headlines, but in quiet conversations behind closed doors, whispers among clients, murmurs in boardrooms, and careful inquiries from competitors now watching the fallout with cautious curiosity. It didn't need to be loud. Consequences rarely do. Their once untouchable image had fractured, not from any public scandal, but from the slow, undeniable truth that they had let go of the very person who had kept them whole. Meanwhile, at Sterling Row, I was no longer a shadow. I wasn't the silent fixer or the second voice behind someone else's strategy. I was, for the first time in my career, at the table, and not because someone offered me a seat out of guilt or optics, but because I had earned it in blood, grit, and quiet resolve. My name was on the briefings now. Clients asked for me directly. The team, sharp, driven, and respectful, leaned in when I spoke, not because they were told to, but because they understood I spoke from hard-won ground. I wasn't rebuilding my life, I was expanding it. And yes, There were still days when the fatigue from treatment would return like a dull weight behind my ribs, when I'd feel the tight pull of my body reminding me where I'd been, what I'd survived. But those moments never defeated me, because they didn't define me. They were simply markers along a road I had walked alone for far too long and now no longer had to. Then came the meeting. It was a Friday afternoon when Nathan, the managing partner at Sterling, invited me into his office. He had that look half formal, half excited that always preceded something significant. "You've brought in 6 new clients in under 2 months," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "And 3 of them were direct pulls from Whitmore Langley. That's not recovery, Margaret. That's conquest." I smiled, not out of vanity, but out of a quiet recognition that all those late nights, silent humiliations, and years of being underestimated had finally distilled into this one undeniable fact. I was no longer someone's employee. I was the one they were watching now. Nathan leaned forward, folding his hands. "We'd like you to take on a senior partner role, advisory and client-facing, with freedom to shape the department your way. No bureaucracy, no second-guessing, just you leading." I accepted, not with wide eyes or trembling hands, but with the same measured confidence I had carried through chemotherapy sessions, betrayal, and the storm of retribution. Because this wasn't luck. This wasn't charity. This was the cost of experience paid in full. Now, when I walk into the office each morning, I no longer shrink into my routines or temper my voice. I walk in as a woman who knows her worth, who remembers what it feels like to be discarded, and who rose anyway, not because she wanted revenge, but because she refused to believe that illness, age, or gender made her invisible. And sometimes, just before the day begins, I pause at the window with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the streets fill below. The city moves, unaware of the story it helped carry, unaware that one of its own found her way back not just to work, but to herself. So to those watching who may be sitting in silence after a layoff, after a diagnosis, or after being told they are no longer relevant, I say this: you are not done. You are not finished. And your story, if you choose to tell, it might just be the beginning of something no one saw coming. Nation, if this story moved you, if you've ever felt forgotten, underestimated, or pushed aside, hit subscribe. Join this community of comeback stories. You're not alone, and your next chapter might be closer than you think.